You're literally waiting to die.
It doesn't bother us. It's something I accepted a long time ago.
In this video, we delve into the chilling case of Ramiro Gonzales, a man whose heinous crimes shook Texas to its core. Convicted for the brutal kidnapping and murder of 18-year-old Bridget Townsend, his actions have left an indelible mark on the lives of many. Join us as we examine the details of this harrowing case, from the crime itself to the legal battles and ultimate sentence that followed. Bridget Townsend was an 18-year-old woman with a bright and promising future ahead of her. Known for her vibrant personality, warm smile, and deep love for her family, she was cherished by everyone who knew her. Living in a close-knit community in Bandera County, Texas, Bridget's disappearance in January 2001 sent shockwaves through the area, leaving her family and friends devastated and the entire community on edge. The day Bridget went missing started like any other. She had plans and routines she followed, but when she failed to return home or communicate with her loved ones, concern quickly turned to panic. Her family reported her missing and law enforcement launched an investigation, which initially provided little information about her whereabouts. For weeks, hope lingered as those closest to her believed she might still be found alive. Her family and friends organized search parties, distributed flyers, and made emotional pleas to the public for any information that could lead to Bridget. Candlelight vigils were held, with dozens of people gathering to support her family and pray for her safe return. The community, though small, rallied together in a show of unity and determination to find one of their own. Despite these efforts, early leads in the case were scarce. Law enforcement faced significant challenges in piecing together Bridget's last known movements. Her disappearance seemed to have occurred without any witnesses or clear evidence. The rural, expansive area surrounding Bandera County posed additional hurdles, making the search for clues both physically demanding and time-consuming. As weeks turned into months, her family's agony grew and hope began to wane. Amid the uncertainty, rumors and speculations circulated about what might have happened to Bridget. Some wondered if she had run away, though those closest to her insisted this was entirely out of character. Others feared she might have been the victim of foul play, a possibility that became increasingly likely as the months dragged on without any sign of her. Law enforcement intensified their efforts, interviewing dozens of people and following up on every potential lead, no matter how small. In the midst of the investigation, another disturbing case surfaced involving Ramiro Gonzales, a young man who had been arrested for the kidnapping and sexual assault of another woman. As authorities dug deeper into his criminal background, they discovered unsettling connections between Gonzales and Bridget's disappearance. While initially circumstantial, these links would eventually lead to the unraveling of the mystery. The anguish of Bridget's family during this time was unimaginable. Her parents described sleepless nights and endless days filled with uncertainty and dread. Her friends clung to memories of her laughter and kindness, mourning her absence even as they held out hope for answers. The pain of not knowing where she was or what had happened to her cast a shadow over the entire community. It wasn't until October 2002, nearly 2 years after her disappearance, that authorities made a grim discovery that would confirm the worst fears of those who loved Bridget. This revelation would not only bring closure to her family but also shine a light on the dark and horrifying actions of Ramiro Gonzales, the man responsible for her tragic fate. The impact of her disappearance and the events that followed would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved, as Bridget's story became a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. Ramiro Gonzales was a young man with a troubled past, a history that would eventually culminate in the tragic events surrounding Bridget Townsend's disappearance and murder. Born and raised in a rural area near Bandera County, Gonzales was described by those who knew him as a quiet and often withdrawn individual. Beneath his reserved demeanor, however, lay a turbulent life shaped by instability, neglect, and a series of poor decisions that would ultimately lead him down a dark and violent path. As a teenager, Gonzales faced significant challenges in his personal life. Accounts suggest that he grew up in a dysfunctional environment, marked by a lack of structure and support. Struggling academically and socially, he often found himself in trouble. He dropped out of school early, drifting aimlessly and becoming increasingly involved in criminal activities. His brushes with the law began with minor offenses but escalated over time as his behavior grew more reckless and dangerous. By the time he turned 18, Gonzales had developed a reputation as a troubled young man. He was known to engage in theft, substance abuse, and other illegal activities to support his lifestyle. His actions often brought him into conflict with others, including law enforcement. Yet despite his mounting legal issues, no one could have foreseen the horrifying escalation that would soon occur. On the fateful day in January 2001, Gonzales crossed paths with Bridget Townsend. While the exact circumstances leading up to their encounter remain unclear, investigators later determined that Gonzales abducted Bridget from a rural home in Bandera County. The details of how he managed to lure or force her into his vehicle are harrowing to consider. What is known is that he transported her to his family's ranch in neighboring Medina County, a secluded location where he believed he could carry out his heinous acts without interruption. Once at the ranch, Gonzales subjected Bridget to unimaginable horror. He sexually assaulted her, exploiting her vulnerability in a way that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The violence of his actions revealed a chilling level of depravity and a complete lack of empathy for his victim. Tragically, after the assault, Gonzales decided to eliminate any possibility of being identified by his victim. He shot and killed Bridget, leaving her lifeless body in a remote area of the property. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, Gonzales showed no signs of remorse. He carried on with his life as though nothing had happened, hiding the evidence of his actions and avoiding detection. For months, law enforcement had no concrete leads tying him to Bridget's disappearance. It wasn't until much later, during an unrelated investigation, that Gonzales came to the attention of authorities in connection with her case. In 2002, Gonzales was arrested for the kidnapping and sexual assault of another woman. During his interrogation, he made statements that raised suspicions about his involvement in other crimes. Detectives began to piece together a disturbing pattern in his behavior, which ultimately led them to investigate his possible connection to Bridget Townsend's disappearance. The discovery of her remains on his family's property confirmed their worst suspicions and provided the evidence needed to charge him with her murder. As the investigation unfolded, more details about Gonzales's life and psyche came to light. Experts who examined his behavior suggested that his violent actions stemmed from a combination of deep-seated psychological issues and a life of unchecked criminality. His lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his crimes painted a portrait of a dangerous predator who posed a significant threat to society. The revelations about Gonzales's role in Bridget's disappearance and murder sent shockwaves through the community. People who had known him were horrified to learn of his actions, struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet young man they thought they knew with the reality of his brutal crimes. For Bridget's family, the knowledge that their beloved daughter had fallen victim to such a monstrous act was a devastating blow, one that would leave them grappling with grief and anger for years to come. Gonzales's arrest marked the beginning of a lengthy legal process that would eventually see him held accountable for his actions. However, the road to justice was fraught with challenges as the true extent of his crimes continued to emerge. The community, shaken by the tragedy, would never forget the pain and loss caused by one man's senseless violence. Bridget Townsend's story, intertwined with the dark legacy of Ramiro Gonzales, remains a haunting reminder of the need to protect the vulnerable and seek justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. For nearly 2 years, the mystery of Bridget Townsend's disappearance remained unsolved, leaving her family in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Every day that passed without answers added to the overwhelming emotional toll. Bridget's parents, friends, and the entire community in Bandera County clung to the hope that one day she would be found and that her safe return would bring the closure they so desperately sought. Yet with each passing month, that hope began to fade, replaced by a creeping fear that something far darker had occurred. The case had been at a standstill, with no leads and no clear evidence pointing to who was responsible for her abduction. As law enforcement worked tirelessly to uncover any clues, the growing fear that Bridget had fallen victim to foul play became more pronounced. Rumors circulated throughout the town, with some speculating that Bridget may have run away or been involved in a tragic accident, though those who knew her well adamantly rejected those theories. Bridget had always been close to her family, and it seemed impossible that she would simply vanish without a trace. In the absence of hard evidence, her loved ones never stopped searching, constantly trying to push the investigation forward. Flyers with Bridget's face were posted across the region, and televised appeals for help became a regular feature on local news programs. As months turned to a year, and then 2, the painful uncertainty remained, consuming those who loved her. Bridget's parents in particular faced sleepless nights and emotional turmoil, their lives put on hold as they waited for a resolution that felt as if it would never come. Then, in the fall of 2002, the case took a shocking and tragic turn. After years of dead ends, law enforcement received a breakthrough that would send shockwaves through the community. Authorities who had been investigating Ramiro Gonzales in connection with a separate crime began to suspect that he may have been involved in Bridget's disappearance. At the time of Bridget's abduction, Gonzales was an 18-year-old man who had already been arrested and charged with the kidnapping and sexual assault of another woman. Investigators began to connect the dots, tracing his movements and criminal history, and soon discovered that Gonzales had been in the area where Bridget was last seen. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Gonzales, already in custody for his earlier crimes, began to make statements during questioning that raised serious suspicions. Though he had initially denied any involvement in Bridget's disappearance, further probing led authorities to believe that he was, in fact, responsible for her abduction and murder. At the time, there was no concrete evidence to directly link him to the crime, but his connections to the area and his disturbing history of violence made him a prime suspect. The most crucial development came when Gonzales, in a shocking revelation, led investigators to the remote ranch where he had taken Bridget following her abduction. It was there, in the desolate terrain of Medina County, that law enforcement discovered her remains. The area was isolated and difficult to access, which had likely kept the body hidden for so long. When the remains were recovered, the evidence was grim and conclusive. Bridget had been violently assaulted and shot, her life brutally taken away by a man who had already demonstrated a pattern of dangerous behavior. The discovery of Bridget's remains brought a sense of terrible finality to the investigation. The anguish of not knowing her fate had been unbearable for her family, but now they were forced to confront the brutal truth that she had been taken from them in such a violent and senseless manner. The pain of losing a loved one is unimaginable under any circumstance, but the circumstances surrounding Bridget's death, a young woman abducted, assaulted, and murdered, were particularly devastating for those who knew her. Her parents, already grieving for their daughter's loss, now had to navigate the overwhelming sorrow that came with the knowledge of how she had suffered in her final moments. For the community, the revelation was equally horrifying. The small, close-knit area had been rocked by Bridget's disappearance, and the discovery of her remains sent waves of shock through the region. People who had once been hopeful for her safe return now grappled with the realization that a predator had been living among them, someone capable of committing such a heinous crime. The recovery of Bridget's body marked the beginning of the next phase in the investigation, the pursuit of justice. With Ramiro Gonzales now firmly linked to the crime, law enforcement began preparing for his trial. The details surrounding the murder, the brutal assault, the shooting, and the calculated manner in which Gonzales had disposed of the body painted a chilling portrait of a man who seemed to have no remorse for the life he had taken. For Bridget's family, the discovery of her remains, while providing answers, also ignited a new wave of pain and outrage. They would now have to fight not only for justice for their daughter, but also to make sure that Gonzales faced the full consequences of his actions. As the case moved forward, it became clear that the investigation into Bridget's murder was about much more than just solving one crime. It was about holding a dangerous individual accountable for his actions and sending a message to the community that such violence would not be tolerated. The discovery of Bridget's remains was not just the end of a painful chapter in the Townsend family's life, but the beginning of a long and difficult journey through the legal system, where justice for Bridget would become the focus of those who sought to ensure her tragic death was not in vain. The trial of Ramiro Gonzales for the kidnapping and murder of Bridget Townsend began in 2006, almost 5 years after her tragic death. By this time, Bridget's family had endured years of emotional turmoil, and the search for justice had become a long drawn-out process. The legal proceedings were their opportunity to hold Gonzales accountable for his actions and ensure that he would pay for the suffering he had caused. But for the Townsend family, the trial was not just about the cold, hard facts of the case. It was also a painful reminder of their daughter's violent death. The courtroom was filled with tension from the moment the trial began. Bridget's parents, who had spent years grappling with the pain of her loss, were now forced to relive the horrors of her abduction and murder. The defense and prosecution presented their cases, each side arguing their interpretation of the events leading up to Bridget's death. For the Townsend family, it was a difficult and emotional process, but it was necessary to ensure that justice was served. The prosecution's case was built around a powerful narrative of a young woman's abduction and murder at the hands of a violent predator. They painted a vivid and horrifying picture of what had happened in the days leading up to Bridget's death, detailing how Gonzales had kidnapped her from her home, taken her to his family's ranch, and subjected her to a brutal sexual assault. The most chilling part of the prosecution's argument was the revelation that Gonzales had murdered Bridget in cold blood, shooting her to eliminate any possibility of being caught. The prosecutors emphasized that Gonzales had shown no remorse for his actions, and the evidence presented in court, including his prior criminal history and his statements to authorities, made it clear that he was a dangerous individual who needed to be removed from society. Key witnesses in the prosecution's case included law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and family members. The authorities testified about the discovery of Bridget's remains and the physical evidence that tied Gonzales to the crime. The forensic evidence revealed the extent of Bridget's suffering, with experts detailing the injuries she had sustained during the assault and the manner of her death. The prosecution also presented Gonzales' own statements during his interrogation, where he implied his involvement in Bridget's murder, even as he initially denied it. This contradiction helped build a case that painted Gonzales as a cold and calculating killer. For the Townsend family, the most emotional part of the trial came when they were called to the stand. Bridget's parents, who had suffered through the agonizing uncertainty of her disappearance and the horrific discovery of her body, were now asked to recount their memories of their daughter. Their testimony painted a picture of a bright young woman full of promise, someone who had her whole life ahead of her. Their grief was palpable as they described the deep pain they felt, knowing that they would never see their daughter again. The defense, however, presented a different narrative. Gonzales' attorneys argued that he had been coerced into confessing to the crime and that the evidence against him was circumstantial. They attempted to challenge the forensic evidence and suggested that there were gaps in the investigation that could leave room for doubt. They also attempted to paint Gonzales as a troubled individual, someone who had grown up in a chaotic and abusive environment, which they claimed might have influenced his actions. Though the defense team argued for a lesser sentence or even a potential plea deal, they struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence of Gonzales' guilt. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was the testimony of expert witnesses who examined Gonzales' psychological state. A prosecution expert had testified that Gonzales was a significant danger to society, making the case for the death penalty. This was crucial in a state like Texas, where the death penalty could only be imposed if the defendant was deemed to be a continuing threat to society. Gonzales' history of violent behavior, including his prior kidnapping and assault convictions, and the brutal nature of his murder of Bridget were key factors in this assessment. However, years later, the expert who had originally testified about Gonzales' dangerousness would later recant his testimony. This would become a point of contention in the case, as it was revealed that the expert's evaluation of Gonzales had been based on faulty data and had not taken into account more recent developments, including Gonzales' apparent remorse and efforts at rehabilitation while incarcerated. This new information would later play a role in the legal battles that followed Gonzales' conviction, as defense attorneys and supporters of Gonzales argued that his death sentence was no longer justified. Despite the defense's efforts to challenge the evidence and seek a lesser sentence, the jury found Gonzales guilty of capital murder. The conviction was a moment of bittersweet victory for the Townsend family, but they knew that this was just one step in the long road to justice. They now had to face the next phase of the trial, the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide whether Gonzales should receive the death penalty. The sentencing phase was equally emotional and tense. The prosecution once again argued that Gonzales should be put to death for his crimes, citing the brutal nature of his actions and his history of violent behavior. Bridget's family members spoke again, emphasizing the emotional toll her death had taken on their lives and the sense of loss they would carry with them forever. The defense, however, argued that Gonzales should be given a life sentence instead of the death penalty, focusing on his troubled upbringing, his efforts to change while incarcerated, and the expert testimony about his potential for rehabilitation. In the end, the jury decided that Gonzales should receive the death penalty. The decision was seen as a reflection of the severity of his crime and the community's desire for justice for Bridget Townsend. Yet even as the jury delivered its sentence, the case was far from over. Gonzales's legal team would continue to file appeals, arguing that his death sentence should be overturned due to the recanted testimony and claims of inadequate legal representation. These appeals would continue for years, prolonging the Townsend family's pain as they waited for final closure. For Bridget's family, the conviction and sentencing of Gonzales provided some measure of justice, but it could never replace the daughter they had lost. The trial, though necessary, had forced them to relive the horrific events surrounding her death, and they would never be able to fully heal from the wounds of that loss. The legal proceedings had been a means to hold Gonzales accountable, but for Bridget's parents, the true justice would come only with time, as they sought to remember their daughter's life, not just the tragedy of her death. The years following Ramiro Gonzales' conviction were marked by a series of legal battles, appeals, and efforts to delay the inevitable: his execution. Despite the clear and undeniable evidence of his guilt, Gonzales's legal team continued to challenge the death penalty sentence, citing factors such as his troubled upbringing, claims of rehabilitation while on death row, and the recanted expert testimony that had originally assessed him as a future danger to society. These appeals added another layer of pain for Bridget Townsend's family, forcing them to confront the haunting reality of her death once again and prolonging their emotional ordeal. Throughout the legal proceedings, Gonzales maintained a sense of defiance, never fully admitting to the true extent of his actions. At times, he expressed regret for his crime, but his remorse was often seen as too little, too late. In contrast, Bridget's family, who had been victimized by his brutal actions, found themselves trapped in a never-ending cycle of legal delays, where the pursuit of justice seemed to stretch on endlessly. They had endured the heart-wrenching pain of Bridget's loss, the shock of her discovery, and the emotional turmoil of the trial, but the lack of finality left them in a perpetual state of limbo. Despite Gonzales's continued attempts to avoid execution, there were few who believed he could escape the penalty for his crime. In 2024, after years of legal wrangling, the state of Texas announced that it would proceed with his execution. It was scheduled for June 26, 2024, and the timing was deeply symbolic. This was the same day that Bridget Townsend would have turned 41. For the Townsend family, the date felt like both an end and a beginning, the end of a long, painful chapter in their lives, and the beginning of a painful reckoning that would bring some measure of closure to the tragedy that had defined their existence for so many years. On the day of his execution, Gonzales, now 41 years old, was given a final opportunity to speak. His last words, though brief, were filled with an emotional apology to the Townsend family. He expressed deep remorse for the pain he had caused them, acknowledging that he could never undo the horror he had inflicted upon their lives. His statement, which read, "I can't put into words the pain I have caused y'all, the hurt, what I took away that I cannot give back. I hope this apology is enough," was a bittersweet moment for everyone involved. For Bridget's family, these words were too little, too late, but they were also a sign that even at the end, Gonzales understood the depth of his actions. The apology, though heartfelt, could never undo the damage he had done, and it could never erase the pain of losing their beloved daughter. As Gonzales was led to the execution chamber, Bridget's family remained on the outside, struggling with their own emotions. For them, the execution was not a moment of celebration, but rather one of painful finality. They had hoped for justice, and now they were witnessing it. But there was no sense of relief, no sense of closure that could fully heal the wounds left by Bridget's brutal death. The act of executing Gonzales would not bring her back, and it would not undo the years of grief that they had suffered. Instead, it was a reminder of the irreversible loss they had endured. The execution was carried out without incident, and Gonzales was pronounced dead shortly after the procedure. As the news spread, it was met with a mixture of reactions. Some saw it as a necessary step in ensuring that justice was served for Bridget Townsend, while others questioned the morality of the death penalty itself. Regardless of one's stance on the issue, there was no denying the emotional weight of the moment. The death of Ramiro Gonzales marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the Townsend family, but it also highlighted the difficult and complex nature of the justice system and the emotional toll that victims' families must bear in order to see that justice is done. For Bridget's parents, the road to this point had been long and fraught with emotional anguish. The trial had forced them to relive their daughter's abduction and murder, and the legal delays had prolonged their suffering. The finality of Gonzales' execution, while providing a sense of closure, could never erase the pain of losing their daughter in such a violent and senseless manner. No amount of justice could bring Bridget back, and no apology from Gonzales could heal the wounds of a mother and father who had lost their child. In the aftermath of the execution, Bridget's family members sought to remember her not for the tragic circumstances of her death, but for the vibrant and loving young woman she had been. They focused on honoring her memory and the positive impact she had on those around her. Friends and family recalled her kindness, her infectious smile, and her aspirations for the future. Though the pain of her loss would never truly fade, the Townsend family made an effort to cherish the moments they had shared with her and to celebrate her life. Gonzales' execution did not erase the horror of what he had done, nor did it provide the Townsend family with the sense of peace they had longed for. But it was a necessary step in their journey toward healing. It was an acknowledgement that justice had been served, that the man responsible for their daughter's death had been held accountable for his actions. And while the pain of losing Bridget would remain with them forever, the execution represented the completion of a process that had begun when she first went missing in 2001. Her family had fought for answers, for justice, and for closure, and in the end, they were able to find some semblance of peace, even if it could never truly heal the wounds of their loss. For those who followed the case, the execution of Ramiro Gonzales became a symbolic moment in the larger conversation about the death penalty, criminal justice, and the lasting impact of violent crime on victims and their families. It was a somber reminder of the consequences of a life taken too soon and the ripple effects that one individual's actions can have on an entire community. For the Townsend family, however, the death of Gonzales was simply one more chapter in a painful story that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. It was justice, but it was not the end of their grief.